So after a disappointment of sorts in my ongoing Big Martial Knife series, and maybe you've seen that video, I felt the need for, shall we call it, a low-risk palate cleanser. Something inexpensive that wouldn't aggravate me if it went catastrophically wrong. And here's where I confess that even though the Cold Steel GI Tanto has been on the market for many, many, many years, I hadn't bought myself one until just now. And I suppose I had my reasons for not buying it, concerns. But having it in hand finally, let's talk about whether any of those concerns were valid. All right, let's start as we often do with the out-of-the-box sharpness. Now we're talking 1055 high carbon steel, secondary edge bevel, but it looks pretty keen. Bit of a hollow grind, which is not my favorite. Traction coating, which I really dislike. Start with some paper. Kind of toothy. A little bit rippy. All right. Not so bad. How about some cardboard? I expect that hollow grind and that traction coating to bind up a bit here, but yeah, it's grabbing. Also kind of sending the knife off course a bit. All right, let's talk about specs. So it comes in Cold Steel's favorite Secure-X sheath, and I've talked about the benefits and the drawbacks of this in prior videos, and so have a lot of other YouTubers. So I won't get into that, but I will talk about some things that are very specific to the fit of this one. Yes, I did flip the strap upside down so it works as a Facone carry flap, and we'll talk about that in carry and handling. But it's a particularly slim sheath, has a big old Cold Steel logo on it. Retention, though, is extra extreme here because those plastic hooks are contacting the really sharp edges of those guard projections. So yeah, the thumb brake is really resistant. Now, if I just rounded off those corners, spoiler alert, probably be a lot smoother. But speaking of smooth, okay, you hear all that scraping happening. Part of that is the traction coating, and part of that is the edge actively rubbing into this material, which is notorious for diminishing edges. Before I talk about my concerns, and yes, put those concerns to the test, I'll give you the specs as is out of the box. The first number I'm going to throw at you is about $26 US is what I paid for this at Chicago Knife Works. Put the link down in the description below. But I do commonly see this knife available for less than $35 US, so there's some perspective for you. For the rest of the numbers, I'm going to look down at my notes so I can give you the metric as well as the imperial, starting with blade length. Now, overall length from those guard projections is 7 inches, about 17 centimeters, but you're losing about an inch, 2.5 centimeters, in this finger choil. That leaves you with about 6 inches of cutting edge and tip. Now, it's got a pretty rectangular profile that is 1.5 inches, about 4 centimeters wide front to back, but blade thickness sort of crosses over into the concern section of the video. That's only 3.5 millimeters, so pretty slim piece of steel. Full tank construction, visible all around. I'll try to get these plastic grip scales off to show you what's underneath, secured with 2 screws. You've got a lanyard hole, grip length, 4.5 inches, so about 11.5 centimeters. Overall length is 12 inches, so about 30 centimeters. Your weight, a bit on the light side, at 11.5 ounces, 326 grams. Point of balance is right there at the guard projections. All right, what are my concerns? Let me put my concerns on the table before we run the tests, starting with the 1055 high carbon steel, which has proven to be awesome in Cold Steel swords and in some of the big Martial knives I've recently reviewed, some of their, shall we call them, historically based models that are in 1055. They've proven themselves to be very, very durable. And my test files put the hardness on those somewhere above 55 HRC. The swords tend to run between 50 and 55. But I don't have enough exposed steel here to get my test files on to get any good numbers yet. However, I can tell you that just having it a couple of days in and out of the SecureX sheath has indeed dulled the edge repeatedly. I have to keep refreshing it, so that's not a good sign. And some of that may be the steel, and some of it may be how slim this blade is. Not only the thickness of the steel itself at 3.5 millimeters, but how keen that edge profile is, that grind. Yes, it does have a bit of a hollow grind. We'll see how that performs. But that secondary edge bevel, yeah, it's a really fine edge. Is it fragile? Well, we're going to find out. Speaking of fragile, other YouTubers have experienced that keen edge extends to a very needle-like tip that is apparently easy to break. We'll find out. Nice touch, though. That back edge is also, well, semi-sharpened, I'll call it. Not as much as the front edge, but you could put an edge on that very easily. Speaking of edges, the other corners they're pretty sharp. And some of it may be the cut of the steel, and some of it may be the traction coating. We'll get back to the traction coating here in a second. But I am going to go ahead and run the impact tests without rounding off the corners of the guard projections. And we'll see how comfortable that is. Speaking of comfortable, the grip is actually, yeah, it does feel good in hand. But how grippy is it, and how does it translate shock back into me? Well, we'll find out. Also, other YouTubers have experienced under extreme impact that these scales break or come loose. We'll find out. But as for the traction coating, all right. Now, I am no fan of these unspecified kind of sprayed-on black coatings on knives. I've seen them on the cold steels. I've seen them on some of the Beckers. They tend to be very, well, disappointingly fragile. But when it comes to traction coating, yeah, I really loathe traction coating. I know some people really like it. There's got to be a reason it exists. Let me know in the comments if you actually like traction coatings. But I found them to, well, give me a whole lot of resistance, binding going through certain materials. If they get gunky, it's really hard to clean your blade. It's like trying to wash sandpaper. And in most cases, I found that finish to be extremely fragile. So let's find out. All right, here we are post-tests. And before I break down the results, my usual caveat. If you're looking for hard fieldcraft testing, it's not what you're going to find on my channel. It's not what I do. Hopefully I can give you the martial practitioner's perspective and the collector's perspective, and hopefully I do those well enough that you keep watching. But a lot of other YouTubers have put this knife through much harder use than you're going to see here, so definitely check out their videos. What you are going to see is that I do often run my blades through a series of impact and durability and shock tests. And it's not so much about what the blade does to the target media, but what the target does back to the blade and how that feels in my hands. So, spoiler, knife is still in one piece. First test, thrusting and stabbing into my Pel, who I've named Stab Him. Stab Him is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of compressed brown paper bag paper backed up by wood. Thrust into it, stabbed into it in hammer grip, handshake grip, and yes, I also flipped it around North American buoy edge towards me orientation to see how that worked, and the answer for all three was awesome. Really comfortable. Surprisingly, no slippage, so I did not collide at all with those uncomfortable corners, and penetration was very good. Flipped it around into the ice pick grip for some stabbing, and yeah, well, penetration much more impressive. Had trouble getting it out of the Pel a few times, but okay, a little bit of discomfort because you can see in this grip that sharp corner does tend to fall into the heel of my hand, so unless I was choked down a little bit further, I felt that a little bit, but it wasn't unbearable at all. Surprisingly comfortable. All right, the next test. People have told me that this one is unfairly abusive, but I'm looking to try to induce a chip or a roll in a fragile edge. So hacking, slashing into a piece of hard bamboo. Sometimes at intentionally bad angles. I also hacked at it with the false edge. And it did really well. Even flipped it around reverse grip, slashed at it that way. Running my fingernail along it, I can feel maybe some microscopic glinting, but I expected a failure here and I didn't get one, so I'm impressed. So moving on to the next test. I shaved on some hardwood boards to see how it worked as a tool, and the answer is, yeah, very well. And then chopped into the boards. Again, this is not about what this would do to the boards, and it was a pretty effective chopper, but would it damage the build at all, and how did it feel in hand? And it did very well. It was very comfortable to use that way. So I moved on to do a little bit of batoning, and I'm using kiln-dried firewood, which tends to be very inconsistent. In some places it falls apart like pulled pork, and in other places it's like concrete. So my first pass through it, I didn't go through a particularly wide part of that log, and it did really well. Pretty clean through, but putting it through a thicker part of the same log, yeah, it totally got stuck. Did it do any damage to the edge? No. To the finish of the blade? Oh yeah, which was exactly as expected. That's usually what I see with these. Did it cause any undue friction getting through the media? Well, I don't know if it shows up very well on the video, but that part of the log it passed through, it left a massive black streak of finish that came off just in that one pass. So yeah, I'm thinking I'm probably going to remove the finish. And then just as an additional test, I did stab it into the boards a bit, and that's where things got uncomfortable. Stabbing into something that hard did jab that corner back into the heel of my hand. So I might have to do something about that. But then I also stabbed it into hardwood and basically, bored some holes to see if I can induce any, failure of the tip. And the answer is, I would say it bent a little bit that way, just barely. Now, if I stabbed this straight down into the wood and twisted it sideways, would it snap? Probably. But I didn't take it that far. Not yet, anyway. So what are our next steps? Well, a lot of people buy these specifically with the intention of customizing them. And that's the thing that I do. So let me see where the inspiration takes me. What's that famous mechanic saying? Every half-hour job is one broken bolt away from being a 3-day ordeal. Yeah, well, at least it wasn't a 3-day ordeal. But when I took off the grip scales, yes, indeed, there is a full tang underneath them. I'll put up a picture. It's interesting, the screws went in from either side and then kind of stuck into the holes in the tang were these little sections of brass tubing that had been threaded. I thought it was kind of an ingenious setup until, I think it was while I was working on the blade using power tools. I think the vibration knocked one of those brass pieces out of the hole to be lost forever. And then I couldn't just reuse the screws that it came with. So what I wound up doing is drilling out the grip panels to accept standard size Chicago screws. And I had a pair that were the right size in an attractive bronze, and they do the job, but also I think they look better than the stock screws. So, like the way it turned out, but it was work I wasn't intending to do. What was I intending to do that I actually got done? Well, yes, I did strip the traction coat off the blade and blued it. And while I was at it, I improved the back edge a bit. As for the guard projections, I thought about taking off the rear one. A lot of people do that, but I figured I'd leave it for now to see if I could work with it. But what I did is I just rounded off all the unfriendly edges and corners without changing the shape of them that much, and then repeated the stabbing and thrusting test, and no more uncomfortable collisions with my hands. So that problem is solved. The other thing I did was, it might be a little bit hard to see, but there used to be a straight edge across the top side of the guard projections. I gave each side a bit of a rounded relief cut. And that serves a couple of functions. One function is they feel much better as finger choils now. But I'm also thinking that maybe they might have some potential to catch an incoming weapon. I'll have to test it somehow. But another benefit to rounding off those edges there, yeah, thumb brake is nice and positive, but no longer a fight. All right. Happy with the way it turned out so far. Let's talk about handling. I'm not going to talk much about carry because with a knife this size, you have a lot of options depending on your preference. But when it comes to handling, this is where I admit I was an idiot and should have gotten myself one of these a long time ago. As for my concerns, well, yeah, I probably could snap off the tip if I did something abusive, and that would include potentially using it as a throwing knife. The finish, well, easy to deal with, and I'm not getting that nasty scrape anymore when I draw it so much. Handle scales, yeah, might indeed fail, but they would be easy to replace with something probably nicer, or maybe just wrap it in cord. As for the feel of the knife in martial application, yeah, surprisingly pleasant to use. Those simple grip scales just seem to fit my hands. In a hammer grip, I can use the top of the scale to lock my thumb in. In a handshake grip, yeah, the fingers just kind of fit into this sort of depression trench in the sides of the grip very nicely. And it's light, it's quick. The profile allows me, I feel, good snap cut options. And yeah, it's quick on the thrust with a very effective tip. Can I flip it around edge toward me, North American Bowie style? And now that I've improved that back edge, yeah, I could use that too. And the geometry works for that sort of thing as well. Flipping it into reverse grip, I could hook my thumb over that pommel if I needed that extra reinforcement. But yeah, the profile of the blade, that definitely enhances that slash in the reverse grip, and yeah, it was pretty powerful in penetration in this orientation. If you happen to prefer your edge towards you in this grip, yeah, that works really well too. And now having a sharpened back edge, that's, yeah, quite effective. When it comes to flipping, that kind of trench in the grip. It's a great purchase for pinch flip. I'm indexing my fingers on that last screw hole. It is also thin enough for Mike to do his finger twirl, which I don't recommend. It's not nearly as safe as doing pinch flipping. But I think it's just a great useful knife, and it certainly also proved itself as a potential utility tool. Now that I've got more steel exposed, my test files are saying it's somewhere maybe just a little bit above the 55 HRC level, but definitely below the 60. So, not the hardest knife. Probably will need to refresh the edge frequently if you're using it for utility tasks, but usable. One niche I think this one would suit would be, well, let's call it an emergency or disposable knife. What am I talking about? Well, I'm not out in the woods much, but I do travel, and sometimes traveling means going through TSA with only carry-on baggage. This would be something I feel like if I needed a knife, I could walk into a sporting goods department. Maybe they have something like this available. I could pick it up, use it while I'm wherever I'm at, and then if I have to leave and go back through TSA, I could, well, gift it to someone. It wouldn't be that bad. Or maybe I'm traveling and I damage or lose, or my knife gets stolen and I need something else to serve. And yeah, I could feel confident walking into a store, just picking up one of these and use it stock as is. It wasn't that bad. Though I do like some of the improvements I've made. Could I make other improvements? Well, check out other YouTube videos and the forums. People have done lots of things with this useful piece of, well, starter stock. But considering I picked it up for less than $30 US, it's a great value. Again, not the best knife, not the fanciest knife, not the sturdiest knife. It did survive the bamboo edge test. I have to give it that. But yeah, I'm pleased with the purchase. And again, I feel like, yeah, I should have just bought myself one of these a long time ago. My trepidations were mostly unwarranted. So if you have any questions about this knife, or you happen to have one, if you've done your own customizing to it, let's get our conversation going as usual in the comments. Otherwise, as always, thank you for watching, following my journey, subscribing to the channel, liking the videos, adding to our conversation, and I hope to see you back for, well, whatever comes next.